can start.
Okay, go.
I'd like to welcome all of you to this Sunday afternoon with presentation, and it's going to be on Look Tin Eli, the most historically significant person ever born right here in Mendocino. You're going to hear 4 really important things about him, and hopefully by the end of the discussion you'll all think he was the most historically significant person ever born here, along with me. First, I want you to know how I met the Look family, because yes, I did meet them. Close to 2 years ago, well, first let me tell you, the Look family currently lives mostly in Hong Kong, but some of the members also live in the United States, or in China, or in Australia, or in Taiwan. But basically, the whole family had a big reunion here about 2 years ago, and they wanted to come to the Kelley House Museum because they wanted to see where their great-grandfather, whose name was Look Tin Eli, was born. We had no idea where he was born. We had to pull out Sanborn maps and do all this research, and eventually we discovered his birthplace. We took them on a walking tour. We stopped at the place where he was born, and then we took them over to the Temple of Kwandai, where they did additional talking. So that totally got me into the Look family, and it really got me completely interested in them. And Look Tin Eli happens to be a really important person here in the United States of America. Before I go into all of his doings, I'd like to introduce Lorraine Hee-Chorley, because she is going to talk about the history of the Chinese here in Mendocino. Then she's going to turn it over to me, and I'll talk about Look Tin Eli. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Lorraine so she can talk about the Japanese. Because this whole thing got started with a grant that we received from the public education facility of, I don't even remember the name of the group. We got a grant from some company, and they wanted us to do, basically, I've always been interested in Look Tin Eli. And I went to a board meeting and started talking about Look Tin Eli, and this woman who happened to be in the board meeting said, I know of a grant I think we can get, and she was able to get it. The grant was about the Japanese and the exclusion laws that went into effect in 1942. The act was 9066. So we're talking about how the Chinese people led into the Japanese internment or concentration camping of the Japanese before World War II. So that's my basic introduction. I'd like to turn it over now to Lorraine Hee-Chorley, and she will talk about the Chinese here in Mendocino.
Okay, so just to give you a little information, I am the great-granddaughter of one of the first Chinese settlers who actually arrived in Mendocino by accident. And so I'm going to give you a brief history, really short, about how the Chinese actually arrived in the county of Mendocino. So Jeff, who is actually here, this is a sampan that actually is still...
That's actually a shrimp jump.
Yeah. That actually is an operation off of Pier 39 that sails from Sausalito to San Francisco. It's owned by the state parks. Anyway, the story is that I have always been brought up with is that my great-grandfather sailed over to California with 6 other vessels to come to California because of the California Gold Rush. And the stories that actually got back to mainland China was that there's so much gold you can pick it up off the streets. And so they, being farmers, and they were actually farmers from the north of Hong Kong, had decided that they were going to venture to California to become rich, because at that time China wasn't doing so well with the drought and all the famine that was happening there. So he and his brother had decided to sail over here to see if they can become rich. Out of those 7 ships, they originally were planning, all these ships were planning to arrive in Monterey, to sail there, because there had been a trade route set up by the Chinese to Monterey Bay, and there was a Chinese fishing village there, and so they were going to land there and disembark and disperse from there. Unfortunately, only 2 ships survived sailing across the Pacific Ocean. And it should be noted that all of these people who were in these ships, they weren't sailors. All they got were some really quick sailing lessons and praying to their God that they were going to cross the Pacific Ocean safely. Only 2 of those ships survived. One did land in Monterey, and my great-grandfather accidentally landed up here at Casper Beach, so he got really off course. And of course, when they arrived here, they had no money. So they had to take jobs wherever there was, and they also discovered that there wasn't gold on the streets to pick up. So what they ended up doing was working at the Casper Lumber Company because of all the lumber companies that were in full operation. Worked there for a while and then made their way down here to the town of Mendocino and actually worked again in the lumber mills, but then started their own businesses. So one of the things I want you to kind of understand that for you guys to understand the kind of laws of them coming into a new country that were specifically targeting the Chinese. And I just want to give you an idea that no other race had municipal, state, and federal laws that prohibit them from doing commerce. And so you can see in regards to the county laws, as my laser is not working, of course, is that in terms of there were the mining tax that was imposed. Then in San Francisco they created the laundry tax, and that basically was, and I have a spelling issue there, anyway, they did a tax on laundries that weren't using vehicles, and so basically that targeted the Chinese because they weren't using vehicles. And then one of the other really silly ones is the San Francisco cubic air tax, which was supposedly for health regulations of how many Chinese could be in a room. So we could move on to California, who followed the footsteps of the anti-Chinese movement, is that they created the foreign miners tax, and then later in 1854, when the temple was constructed, the Supreme Court ruled that no Chinese person could testify against a white person. It should be noted, at the time of these taxes were being imposed, California had a financial crisis. And so they profit a lot from all these additional taxes that they were imposing. And I haven't listed all the taxes that were imposed in California, and specifically San Francisco, because they had the fishing tax, they had another licensing fishing tax in terms of netting, etc. But it gives you an idea of just what some of the not small, but major laws that really affected the Chinese. And then you can see in 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was put into place, look at California legislators declared a legal holiday to allow the public to do anti-Chinese demonstrations to support that exclusion law. So going on to the federal laws, which is where the exclusion law falls in, is actually in 1879. That is the first congressional act, not the first correction, but really significant, actually limits the number of Chinese who can enter in this country on a ship. And then in 1880, to discourage the Chinese laborers from entering this country, was another act that prohibited the entry of any Chinese laborers. And it's interesting, within this law, which I didn't write the detail, that you had to prove, if you were an educator, you had to actually literally try to prove that you were an educator and not a laborer. But the way they wrote the law up, everything fall under the word laborer. So in 1882, you see the actual Chinese Exclusion Act, and basically it's a 10-year moratorium on labor immigration. And again, it tells you they had to obtain a certificate from the Chinese government to prove that they qualified to be able to come into this country. And again, they actually, defined what skilled and unskilled laborers were. So let me go on to the 1888. Is back in 1888, they enlarged upon that law and actually says here, prohibits the Chinese from re-entering after they have temporarily left the U.S. So again, you show how the laws were really finely tuned as time goes on. And then in 1892, they basically renewed the 1882 Exclusion Act. And there, again, was telling you in 1892 you had to have a proof of residency. So let me go on to my great-grandfather, which you're seeing in this picture here. And he is, standing next to him is my grandmother, Yip Lee, who was actually born on the property where the Temple of Kwandai has been constructed. And so this is a picture of her, and if you look really closely at her feet, is what I was told from my mother, when she was really young, they started to bind her feet. And it was the belief that then she would marry up because she would have bound feet. And so unfortunately, she was somewhat crippled because of the bound feet that she had when she was a little girl. Then I'm just showing you basically, as Jeff did, this is just a small, we had a reunion about 2 years ago as well to bring all the Lees and the Hees together, and this is just a small portion to show you how diverse our family has become over the years, but how large it has grown, just like Jane is going to show you how Tin Eli's family tree has grown as well. But what I want to talk about is that when the Chinese actually arrived here, they needed a place to worship. And this temple actually is dated back as far as 1854 and is verified by the California State Architecture because he came to actually look at the boards and the nails that were used in this building. And this temple was actually constructed by my great-grandfather, and it's a Taoist temple. And it should be noted that this temple, no white person was allowed to enter until in the last 30 years, but no white person was. This was the only place that was sacred that the Chinese could enter and feel protected. There are 6 original temples left in California. This is one of the 6, and every temple within the different communities, they house different gods. This temple is, on the outside of it, it says the Temple of Kwandai. And I know that even today when I was dosing, a lot of people call it the Josh House. Every temple has a proper name, and that's what it needs to be called by. And when people refer to it as Josh House, it's because it's mainstream. That is the term that they have given these temples because obviously they couldn't read Chinese at the time. And we do burn sticks that are called Josh sticks within the temple itself. But this is Kwandai, and a lot of people, especially when I was visiting Taiwan, asked, why do you have Kwandai and not Matsu, who's the goddess of the sea, because we're near the ocean? And I really surmise that my great-grandfather probably prayed to Kwandai to protect him and keep him safe crossing the Pacific Ocean. And because he did make it over, that in honor of him. But in addition to that, they lived in a community. Racism in Mendocino was not overt, it was more covert. Whereas in Fort Bragg and surrounding areas, it was much more overt than covert. And so this community had built this place of worship for them to come and actually be able to get advice from the priest. It should be noted that this building is not really large, and it's not like Christianity where they all amass and come on a very specific day. The Chinese, in terms of the Taoist religion, come and go all hours of the day. And the priest was always there in the back room, readily available for advice or to give prayers. And so the community itself would always be there to go in and out. The thing it should be noted, the only time you saw a large group of Chinese here at the temple is during Chinese New Year's. But again, families would come and go and celebrate outside, but also bring their food in to be blessed by the gods and to take that food home and to eat. And there are lots of excerpts in the Mendocino Beacon which are not very flattering, about saying, oh, the Celestials or the Chinamen are celebrating again, and they're going to be, firing off their firecrackers, not knowing, what was the real reason. And the reason for the firecrackers is to keep the evil spirits away. And so, if you look at this temple, it has 9 steps, and it has windows that are exposed, because it is the belief that evil spirits can't climb 9 steps. Whereas another temple in Weaverville is built on ground level, and it has windows, but it has screens in front of the windows because it's believed that the evil spirits can't go around corners. This building is red and green. It's the only red and green building in the town of Mendocino, the historic district of Mendocino. And it's very symbolic because in Chinese culture, red and green is a predominant colors that they use, but in religious structures, they are red and green. Red means joy, good luck, and green means life, wealth. So I'm taking you inside, if you haven't entered the temple, to see how narrow it really is and how small it is. And what you're entering there is the very first table where they would set food down. And then there's the middle altar where incense are set and lit. And there are also food items on that altar for the gods and for the ancestors. And way behind there is the main altar, which actually is a picture of Quan Dai himself. And here's the main altar, and you're seeing again food offerings for him, as well as a picture for him. And yes, there's a statue of him that was a gift from the temples in Taiwan that was blessed before we brought it over. And then actually on the ends here, you will see fortune sticks, and those are sticks that households would have, and they would bring them to the temple to have the priest read their fortune. Then I'm going to go on to Jane. But basically what I wanted to do was just to give you a brief history of the temple that was built in 1854, and to give you an idea of this was the only sacred place for the Chinese community here. And to also, the last note is to, a lot of people ask, well, how many Chinese were here in Mendocino? It has been documented that by oral history that in the 1870s there were 500 to 700 Chinese living in Mendocino, in the city of Mendocino, not in the county, but in the city of Mendocino. And that the Mendocino Headlands, which is now the state park, was basically Chinatown, and that's where most of them had resided. And when they would look up, they would see this temple and be reminded that they needed to stay loyal to each other. So now I'm going to move on so that Jane can focus on Tin Eli, who was born here as well.
Thank you. Tin Eli. Boy, he was a really important man who was born here in Mendocino. But before I start talking about him, you have to hear about his father. First, let me check my notes so that I know when I have to change the slides. So, Luk Bing Tai was Tin Eli's father's name in Chinese. His name here was Eli Luk. Or wait, was it Eli Tiaki? Who knows what his name was, because the Chinese people had so many names. They had birth names, they had childhood names, they had adult names, they had school names, they had courtesy names, they had so many different names. But we're just going to call him Eli Luk because that was his American name. He was born in China in 1832, and in 1860 he came to the United States. He didn't come on the same boat with Lorraine's family, obviously. He arrived in Monterey in 1860, and he brought some goods with him on the boat. He brought rice, sausage, salted eggs, shrimps, and bean curd on the boat so that he'd have food when he arrived in Monterey. He arrived in Monterey. He didn't find gold lying in the streets, and that frustrated him terribly. So he decided to take off for San Francisco. He didn't find it lying in the streets in San Francisco either, so he just kept walking until he arrived in Mendocino. And he noticed we had a lumber mill here, so he took jobs here. And he earned enough money that by 1870 he was able to open his own store right here in Mendocino. It was the westernmost Chinese residence in Mendocino. So Tin Eli was born in 1870. And Tin Eli is this young boy right here. There's his mother, who happens to be a Native American woman, his sister, and his first brother. Tin Eli's mother was a Native American because when Eli Luk arrived here, there were very, very, very few Chinese women here, and he needed a wife. And he was not allowed to marry a white person, so what was his choices? He had to marry a Native American. He picked Sue Wang to be his wife, and together they had 4 children. Tin Eli was the first child. Second child was a girl. We don't even know her name. I do have it written in Chinese, and I'm waiting for Chloe to translate it for me at some point. And the third child, we called him Yu, Y-O-U, look you, Eli, but they know him as Tai Long or something like that, his Chinese name. And then they had another brother whose Chinese name was Luk Pung Shang, but he was known here as Li Eli. Eli happened to be quite a whiz at mathematics, and he even got accepted to UC Berkeley. From Mendocino, pretty odd. Now, we didn't have a Chinese high school here in Mendocino, so Tin Eli happened to be educated by a tutor who studied at Yale. He lived here in Mendocino. He happened to be I can't remember the word, the notary public here in Mendocino. His name was G. Canning Smith, and he was Tin Eli's tutor, and that was Tin Eli's high school, was his studying with G. Canning Smith. His younger brother may have attended Mendocino High School, but we're not certain of that. Mendocino High didn't start until 1894. Tin Eli was already 24 years old by then. His brother was born in 1878. He may have attended Mendocino High, but I doubt it. Anyway, so in 1872, Tin Eli's first wife was a Chinese woman. She was born in 1872. And then, in 1874, Eli Tiki ran this ad in the West Coast Star. The Mendocino Beacon picked up the ad, and that shows the ad in the Beacon. His store was at the western point of Chinatown, and he sold cigars, tobacco, rice tea, boots, shoes, matting, clothing, matting, etc., etc. Had a great store. He did good business. His store was in business for 40 years. Pretty unbelievable. So, in 1879, when Tin Eli was 9 years old, his family had enough money that they sent him back to China to learn the language, learn the customs. When he came back in 1884, the Chinese Exclusion Act was already in effect. And as you've already learned, the Chinese Exclusion Act disallowed any Chinese person from entry into the United States. So, this happens to be a copy of the Chinese Exclusion Act. I know you can't read it. I just wanted you to be able to see it. It was supposed to be in effect for 10 years, but it kept being renewed. It was in effect until 1943. From 1884 until 1943. That's pretty incredible. 1882 until 1943. In 1943, we basically allowed 105 Chinese people a year entry into the United States. We did fantastic with that, didn't we? That was the way it was until 1963, when we basically put 20,000 people from any one country was allowed entry into the United States. And that's how it was until 1990, when immigration law established a flexible worldwide cap that was based on family, employment, and diversity. So, Tin Eli was basically disallowed from entry into the United States. His family took major exception to that. It's a little too soon for that. His family took major exception to that and hired him a really good attorney. But he was very, very lucky in the judge that he got, because the judge looked at all the immigration laws that were ever put into effect here in the United States. The very first one was put into effect in 1790, and that said that you had to be white and of good moral character to become a citizen. Tin Eli wasn't white. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was written into the Constitution, and that said that you could be black and of good moral character and become a citizen. Well, he wasn't black either. So could he be a citizen? That was the question that was put to the judge. The other question that was put to the judge was, who is his allegiance to? Who is he sovereign to? Was his allegiance to the United States, or was it to China? He just spent the last 5 years in China, so who is he sovereign to? Well, the judge decided that since the United States allowed black people to become citizens, he assumed that meant anyone who was born here could become a citizen. So he called Tin Eli a citizen, but he still had to deal with all the awful laws that every Chinese person had to deal with. He had to cut off his queue. He couldn't be allowed back in China without it. He wasn't allowed to marry white people. He wasn't allowed to testify in court against white people. All those awful rules he had to live with. But they called him a citizen, which gained him re-entry to the United States, allowed him to come back up to Mendocino, complete his schooling here, and go on with the rest of his life. So we're very happy about that. This is a copy of the court document that was written up granting Look Tin Eli citizenship. And this is the handwritten copy. They all were handwritten back in the day because they didn't have typewriters. So they did this copy was basically handwritten on something that had been formatted previously. So he was allowed re-entry into the United States. He came back up to Mendocino. He finished his schooling here. And then in 1890, he went back to China. This was basically his passport back in the day. They didn't have actual passports. He had to have this whole letter written up, and it had to be signed by people living here, saying that they trusted him and knew that he lived here. And some of the men on this piece of paper were very important men here in Mendocino, like Eugene Brown, like Everson, like Jarvis. They were all really important people here in Mendocino. So this was basically his passport so that he could go back to China and gain re-entry when he came back. In 1893, Eli Look, who's Look Tin Eli's father, took the second son back to China. The second son stayed in China and had 11 kids, believe it or not. 11 kids. In 1894, Look Tin Eli went back to China briefly, married his wife, and she gave birth to their first son the following year in 1895. In 1894, Eli Look also died in China. He had purchased a whole bunch of property, a huge amount of acreage, and left it to his second son to farm, and that's exactly what he did. So, Look Tin Eli came back to the United States in 1895, and then in 1897, he took up residence in Chinatown in San Francisco. This is what Chinatown used to look like in San Francisco. So, who do you think extended the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1904 until 1943?
Thomas Gary.
No?
No.
What president?
Oh.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, Gary was the congressman from Santa Rosa.
Yeah, but Teddy Roosevelt was the president who signed the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act into effect until World War II. Teddy Roosevelt did that. I find that incredible.
Excuse me.
Just thought I'd throw that in. So, in 1906, Look Tin Eli took up residence with the excuse me. In 1904, Look Tin Eli helped establish the only branch of the Russo-Chinese Bank in the United States. It was a bank that had Russian and Chinese money and did basically all the banking for the Russian and Chinese people. Then in 1906, the earthquake happened. And that was a really important part of Look Tin Eli's life. Here's the earthquake. When the earthquake happened, the fire that followed the earthquake destroyed Chinatown. And San Francisco really wanted to make itself devoid of Chinatown. So they first took all the Chinese people and moved them forcibly to the north part of Van Ness Street. The neighbors there complained about the smells. They then moved them over to the Presidio where the neighbors complained about the smells. They then decided they wanted to make Hunters Point Chinatown. That's all the way in southern San Francisco, very far from downtown, and that's all the Chinese people knew. So Look Tin Eli put out the word to everyone he knew. One of the people in China even wrote to San Francisco telling them to give Chinatown back. But San Francisco wouldn't have any part of that. They wanted to remove the Chinese. So the Look Tin Eli started a movement where he was trying to move Chinatown out of San Francisco. he had offers from 3 cities to move Chinatown to LA, Oakland, and Seattle. And when the higher-ups in San Francisco heard that, they gave them Chinatown back. Look, Tin Eli then decided that he had to create a town of veritable fairy palaces so that all the tourists would get involved with Chinatown, so that if anyone ever tried to take Chinatown away again, it wouldn't just be the Chinese arguing against it, it would be the tourists arguing against it as well. So he hired American architects to build the exaggerated pagodas that you find in every Chinatown in the United States today. And this guy was born right here in Mendocino. I mean, that blows me away. If you walk into any Chinese restaurant, ask them if they have, well, never mind, it doesn't have anything to do with this. Anyway, I get so excited when I'm talking. Anyway, okay. Look, Tin Eli then decided that he wanted to create a town of I already said that. He hired I already said that. This is his Sing Chong Bazaar. This is the first place that he worked. He basically ran their Chinese business. It was the Sing Chong Bazaar, and it was a huge Chinese business. And he spent a lot of time in China, and he spent a lot of time here. And this was the very first place that he hired the American architects to build. And you can see the pagodas on the top. The dragons are also there. They didn't have dragons or pagodas in southern China. He just told the architects to build Oriental style, and they came up with this. It didn't have anything to do with anything, but that's what we have. So then, in 1907, Look, Tin Eli decided that it would be a shame if all the Chinese people that had to rebuild all their buildings had to borrow all the money from the white people. There was no Chinese bank in the United States at that point in time. Look, Tin Eli opened the very first international Chinese bank right here in San Francisco. It was called Canton Bank of San Francisco. It was opened using Chinese and Chinese American money, but using American banking practices. So it was very unusual in that regard. And it was very highly esteemed by white people and Chinese people. It did millions of dollars of business every year. And it basically did most of the business of all the Chinese people here in the United States and Mexico. He was very, very well known and an excellent businessman. Then he came home for a little visit. Oh no, he didn't. That'll be in another minute. I'm sorry. I'm just learning how to do this with slides. I'm accustomed to using. This was the first Canton Bank of San Francisco. It's now the East-West Bank, but it was the original Canton Bank of San Francisco.
It's still there?
It's still there as the East-West Bank. It's not there as Canton Bank. The East-West Bank is still there. That's a fairly current picture, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In 1908, Look, Tin Eli got the San Francisco officials to allow the Chinese to burn fireworks for their New Year's. I thought that was an interesting little fact. Then in 1910, Eli T. or Eli Look, sold his business to his cousin. Then in 1910, Look, Tin Eli lived in San Francisco with his wife and his 13-year-old adopted daughter. Who's heard of such a thing? But he had a 13-year-old adopted daughter who lived with him in 1910. It may have been his second wife. We know that Look, Tin Eli had 3 wives. No one knows the name of his second wife. It may have been Mary. Who knows? I'm making it up. It may have been Mary, though. His third wife was a Chinese woman. She gave birth to 2 sons, and Look, Tin Eli's first wife gave birth to 2 sons. Look, Tin Eli came back to Mendocino. I don't remember when this was. I don't even know what number this slide is. Okay, yeah. So yeah, that happened probably around 1910. Look, Tin Eli came back to Mendocino. You can read it. It shows what an important man he was. Yeah, he was a managing director. He was a real, you can all read it. I'm not going to talk in it. You can read it. Are you all done? Yes. Okay. So, in 1912, well, $21,000 worth of opium was seized from the vaults of the Canton Bank of San Francisco. Now you have to know that opium did not become illegal in the United States until 1909. It didn't. So, Look, Tin Eli may have been charged with a violation of the Poison Act. Who knows? Over 6 million pounds of opium were legally imported to the United States between 1900 and 1909. Legally.